So here we have the Etymotic ER2XR extended response earphone from Etymotic. As you can see, this is an in-ear monitor developed by Etymotic, which claims to have high accuracy, noise isolation, and obviously they go in your ear. You can sort of tell from the box that this is a bit different in terms of its design in the sense that it has this really deep reaching ear tip flange which goes really deep inside your ear, which obviously provides you with really good noise isolation. But in terms of fit, people might have some issues with that. Now personally, I don't have any issues with how this fits in my ear. I find that it goes in really easily once you get used to it, but for those of you who are used to more conventional earphones, it will take some adjusting to, and depending on your ear canal, it might or may not be as comfortable as I find it. So I would recommend, if you can audition this first, that you try it. But if you can't, the ER2XR and the ER2SE, they go for around $100. So they're not that much of a deal breaker if you find that it doesn't really fit inside your ears. So moving on to the design of the earphones themselves, they come in this really nice carrying pouch. Well, I say really nice, it's still a sort of soft shell carrying pouch. It's definitely not as protective as a hard shell case. So if you stood on this or if you sat on this, you might actually squish the earphones and potentially break them. But this is really nice just for general carrying around in a bag, and it's quite low profile. It's not too big or not too small. I find that the earphones sort of bunch in really nicely in this case, but it's just your standard sort of zipper case. You can open it and the earphones can just rest inside. You do have another compartment here with sort of like a Velcro, sort of like a strap where you can put other cables or other ear tips in here. I just have it empty. Taking out the earphones themselves, they look very familiar if you're familiar with any other Etymotic earphone, which sort of follows the same design philosophy as I have since the 90s actually. So you have a cylinder sort of housing basically, and attached with these like really really deep ear tips which go right into your ear. Basically it's supposed to touch the bony part of the ear where flesh kind of grows directly on the bone. That might sound scary at first, and to be honest, when you're first trying this, it is quite intimidating. But I find that once you do get used to it, these are actually quite comfortable. I often forget that I have these in my ears, but obviously they will take some getting used to. And if you don't like the idea of sticking stuff inside your ears, you will probably not like this earphone. I'd recommend you buy something like an earbud type, maybe a headphone. But if you're open to the idea of like shoving this like really deep inside your ear, like basically like in here, they will become comfortable over time, especially as these sort of soften up and become more compliant to your ear. It gets a lot better. And the cable is kind of just a normal cable. I wouldn't say it's anything too special. I kind of wish that it was braided or had something like some special coating to help with the microphones, because when these are in your ear, you can hear the cable rubbing against your clothes or your chest. But again, I wouldn't use this earphone because it isolates a lot of sound. I wouldn't necessarily use this when you're like out exercising or running, because it's kind of a hazard. You might get hit by a car. This is more of a stationary sort of portable earphone. So let's say you're in a plane, you're in public transport, you're in a car, you want to just zone out, but you don't necessarily need to pay attention to your surroundings. This is a really good earphone for that. And it rivals, as I said, a lot of active noise cancellers in the sense that it blocks out a lot of sound. And if you have music playing, especially if you have like loud music playing, you won't really be disturbed by like a bus outside, let's say, for instance. Obviously some sound still leaks in. It's not like a perfect remover of like outside influence, but it's, as far as earphones go, this is pretty much top tier in terms of the isolation it provides. And now moving on to the sound of this earphone, as I said, Etymotic claims that it's the most accurate earphones in its class. And Etymotic is in sort of a unique position to claim that because they do a lot of auditory research, and they have done a lot of research specifically into how we perceive sound. And when you hear these earphones, you kind of realize just how wonky like a lot of other earphones sound, because this earphone is basically the textbook definition of neutrality, minus the bass boost obviously. So this is the XR model. It comes with a I'd say a plus 5 dB bass shelf, which gradually rolls down, but it's mostly constrained in the sub-bass regions. And this earphone is very clean sounding. So despite having a dynamic driver, it sounds a lot faster than you would expect. And when I say fast, I just mean that the transient response of this earphone is quite snappy. So it's not like a slow thumping bass, but it's a very tight, fast bass. That has its trade-offs in the sense that if you listen to a lot of hip-hop, if you listen to a lot of EDM, you might not necessarily find that this provides enough bass, even though this is the bass boosted version of the Etymotic sort of house sound. They do a very tasteful bass boost. They don't overly accentuate the bass, and the bass here is very clean and tight, but you could even argue that this is even a bit analytical, even though this is the extended bass version of the sort of ER series. Obviously with such a small driver too, it doesn't move as much air as you might need to get that sort of visceral bass punch. But that's generally not what you buy an Etymotic earphone for. In terms of the rest of the frequency response, I'd say the tonality is basically spot on neutral. The only thing I would give it fault is that some people do say that there is accentuation somewhere in the upper mids. I don't really find that to be true. Or actually, now that I think about it, it can have a bit of a forwardness in terms of some vocalists, but it's not a huge accentuation. I think it's a bit overplayed. My main gripe with this is that sometimes the treble, in terms of cymbals, maybe even upper mids, can sound a bit dark and recessed because there isn't the accentuation there that I'm used to. So a lot of earphones, like headphones, even those right there, those are the Audio-Technica ATH MSR7Bs. A lot of earphones, headphones these days have a V-shaped profile, which means that they have a boosted bass, a recessed mid section, and then a boosted upper mid and treble section. And that gives the sound a lot of excitement, but it also makes it sound sort of unnatural, a bit forward at times. And with this, it takes away that forwardness that you might be used to. So cymbals don't sound splashy at all. They sort of sound in proportion to the rest of the mix. But in direct comparison to other earphones, they might come across as a bit dark sounding, a bit dull sounding. It's not necessarily the fault of these earphones. It's more the fault that we're used to hearing things that are just, emphasized. It's like if you turn up the saturation on a monitor, like a PC monitor, like a phone screen or something like that, and then you go to a calibrated monitor that is not as saturated, it might seem lacking at first, but what you realize is that you're actually seeing an accurate image, just not an emphasized image. And this is basically how I would describe the ER2XR, minus that bass boost, which you may or may not feel like is necessary. I personally feel that at times it can get a bit too much, even for me. And that's someone who does listen to like some hip-hop, electronic. I listen to a lot of rock, and I can definitely hear that there is a bit of a boost in the mid-bass that I would not necessarily like to have there. I'd rather have it constrained in the sub-bass, which it mostly is, but it does bleed a little bit, like very slightly, into the mid-bass. But thankfully the bass is very clean and tight, so it's not a huge issue. Textural resolve in terms of the texture and detailing of the bass is also very good, and mid separation clarity is also really good. The only other thing I have to say about this is, in terms of the soundstage, yes, a lot of people do say it is a bit closed in, and they're sort of right in the sense that it's not a very wide soundstage. Obviously, when you're shoving something this deep inside your ear, it's sort of hard to get a really big stereo separation between the left and right channels. But I will say that even though the soundstage isn't necessarily wide or expansive, it doesn't sound too closed in, and I don't get fatigued, with a very middle in your head image like I do with some other earphones. For example, I have a pair of really cheap Philips earphones that when you listen to them, there's basically no separation between left and right. There's only a center, and it's just really jarring, and it's just really fatiguing because it sounds like it's literally coming from the middle of your brain. This earphone doesn't fall into that category, although if you're looking for a wide soundstage in an earphone, you should probably look elsewhere from the Etymotic ER2XR. But apart from that, there's not really much I can say. In terms of value, I think that the ER2XR is kind of a fantastic value in the sense that this cost me I bought this for around 157 Australian dollars, which I believe is around like 100 something US, even maybe cheaper than that, with shipping to Australia, you know, so that's taken into account. In terms of value, this is really one of the best value earphones you can currently get at its price point. The only other thing I have to compare to the ER2XR is if I come here and grab my Tin Hi-Fi T4. This is an earphone that costs kind of similar in price. The build on this is a lot better, and it comes with a much better cable. But in terms of sound, I think that you could go either way. The Tin T4 sounds a bit more sterile, I would say. There's not as much. The bass sounds just a bit lacking for me with the Tin T4. Even the ER2XR can lack a bit of bass for some genres, but this sounds a lot more natural than the Tin T4. It doesn't have the peaks that the Tin T4 has. I find that this, though, does sound more exciting. It does sound a bit more clarity in the sense that it just brings out the high frequencies a lot, which makes it easier to hear, which isn't necessarily an accurate sound, but it's enjoyable nonetheless. So I would say that this is a really good neutral benchmark for the price. This is an earphone that you should probably get if you don't know what you like in an earphone yet. So if you buy the ER2XR and you find that it's lacking in bass, then you know that you sort of want a bass boosted earphone. If you find it's lacking in the highs, you would know that you want a sort of bright leading earphone. And if you think that it lacks bass and highs, you might like a sort of V-shaped earphone. But this will let you know what you like, because this is a really good neutral reference, and I find that there's nothing really that competes with it in this price point. There's nothing that comes really close to it. Even when you compare this to earphones that cost more, the ER2XR still stands with them. Like, it's not like it's being blown out of the water. And if you're familiar with Critical, he gave the ER2XR a B+ ranking, which may not sound like the best ranking in the world, but when you consider that a lot of earphones in the category that cost maybe $500 to $1,000, even the like the Shure SE846 is a quad driver earphone, has the same ranking as the ER2XR, which is a single dynamic driver earphone. It sort of speaks to the value of this, and yeah, I mean, there's not really much I can say. I highly recommend these, and I think that everyone who is sort of into earphones should at least hear these once in their life.